No one expected what happened next when Robert De Niro walked onto the set of The View. What began as a routine appearance spiraled into one of the most jaw-dropping live confrontations in television history. And at the center of it all? Clint Eastwood. Unflinching, unbothered, and ultimately, unstoppable. Make sure to like and subscribe. It began like any other episode of The View. Bright lights, polite chatter, a well-dressed audience eager to witness another round of celebrity, interviews and political jabs. But the moment Robert De Niro stepped onto the set, something felt different. His smile was tight, his shoulders tense. As he took his seat across from Clint Eastwood, the tension in the studio was no longer speculation. It was fact. Why did De Niro agree to appear on the same day as Eastwood? Why was his greeting clipped, his posture rigid, his eyes lingering just a second too long on the man who sat unbothered beside him? Could it be that De Niro wasn't there to talk about a film at all, but to make a point, one sharp enough to draw blood? Clint Eastwood, decades older but entirely unfazed, sat with a calm that bordered on defiant. He had not come for a fight, but he knew one was coming. That much was clear in the way he barely glanced at De Niro when they were introduced. The crowd clapped with the usual enthusiasm, oblivious to the undercurrent that had just pulled the show into dangerous waters. As the hosts began the segment, steering the conversation toward De Niro's latest project, the veteran actor responded with a few clipped remarks. But even in his restraint, his disdain bubbled just beneath the surface. "I just think we have a responsibility," De Niro said, his eyes flicking toward Eastwood, "not to romanticize the past, especially when the past wasn't so romantic for a lot of people." The comment was vague, but loaded. And Clint Eastwood, a man whose very image had come to represent the mythos of American grit and moral clarity, turned slowly toward De Niro. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. Eastwood did not defend himself. He simply waited. And what was Niro waiting for? Applause? Agreement? Or was it that he expected Eastwood to fold, to crumble under the weight of modern scrutiny and shame? Was this confrontation planned, or had resentment simply reached its boiling point? A host attempted to pivot. "Clint, your latest film has sparked some debate." But De Niro interrupted, leaning forward. "Debate?" he scoffed. "Is that what we're calling it now? Some of this stuff is not up for debate. There are facts, there's truth, and then there's nostalgia dressed up as honor." The studio froze. Even the camera operators hesitated, unsure whether to zoom in or cut away. The hosts glanced at one another, realizing too late that the show was no longer in their hands. De Niro had seized the moment, and Eastwood had yet to speak a word in response. Why had no one intervened? Why had no one told De Niro to back off? Or had they tried and failed? This was no longer an interview. This was a collision. A generational, philosophical, and deeply personal collision. The kind that does not end with a handshake, but with scorched earth. Clint Eastwood finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "You done?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a fact check. De Niro didn't answer. He sat back in his chair, his jaw clenched, breathing hard through his nose. And in that moment, the temperature in the room dropped. The View had just become something it was never meant to be. A battlefield. And the war had only just begun. Clint Eastwood did not raise his voice. He did not match De Niro's intensity or meet his aggression with equal heat. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on his knees, and delivered the first real blow with the kind of quiet force that shakes a room. "You know, Robert," he said slowly, "some of us built things, others just tore them down." The words were measured, almost gentle, but the effect was immediate. The audience didn't know whether to clap or gasp. The hosts went still, unsure if they were witnessing television gold or the kind of disaster that would be dissected for weeks to come. De Niro blinked, caught off guard by the restraint, by the confidence of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard. Built what? De Niro shot back, a scoff in his voice. A fantasy? A version of America where only one kind of man got to be the hero? The implication hung in the air, heavy and raw. De Niro wasn't just questioning Eastwood's legacy. He was accusing him of myth-making, of creating a world in which moral complexity was reduced to black hats and white hats, where the good guys always carried guns and the bad guys always deserved what they got. Clint narrowed his eyes. You call it fantasy. I call it principles. Standing your ground, knowing right from wrong. And who gets to decide what's right? De Niro snapped. You? Because you made a few westerns? You think that gives you moral authority? Eastwood tilted his head. Not authority, just perspective. Earned the hard way, not handed out by applause lines. The exchange was no longer subtle. It had become a duel, not of fists but of ideologies. Two aging titans, both hardened by decades in the spotlight, now dragging their histories into a raw, live confrontation. And as their words clashed like steel on steel, the set of The View became a crucible. One host tried to intervene, her voice shaky. Can we focus on the film? Maybe bring it back to... But Eastwood ignored her. He was locked in. Not out of anger, but resolve. You've spent your whole career telling people what to think, Robert. But what have you risked? What have you stood alone for? De Niro stared at him, stunned into silence. He hadn't expected the conversation to shift this way. He had arrived prepared for a debate about values, for a performance. But Eastwood wasn't performing. He was confronting. You don't know me, De Niro said, his voice low, but uncertain now. I know enough, Clint replied. I know. Bluster when I see it. I know when someone's talking because they're afraid of listening. There it was. The moment the audience turned. A murmur swept through the room not because Clint had shouted, but because he had struck a nerve, publicly, irrevocably. De Niro's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his water, the cool actor's mask slipping at the edges. And Eastwood, still calm, still grounded, sat back in his chair like a man who had already won a war without firing a shot. In the control room, producers stared at monitors, fingers hovering over the commercial break button. But no one dared interrupt. This wasn't just compelling television. It was history. Unscripted, unplanned, and painfully real. The confrontation had started as a sparring match. Now it was something far more dangerous. Pride was wounded. Truth had been twisted. And neither man was about to back down. Would De Niro regain control, or would Eastwood continue dismantling him piece by piece? The silence between them said it all. They were far from finished. The air inside the studio had grown thick, like the final moments before a storm breaks wide open. Every camera remained locked on the two men. Not a single host dared to steer the conversation anymore. They had become spectators, silent witnesses, to a clash that had left even the most seasoned crew stunned into immobility. Robert De Niro leaned forward again, visibly rattled but too proud to retreat. His tone shifted from righteous to biting, like a man trying to reclaim control not just of the conversation, but of his image. You talk about standing alone, he said, voice sharp. But standing alone doesn't make you right, Clint. Sometimes it just makes you stubborn. Or blind. There was no applause, no reaction. The audience could feel the imbalance. De Niro's voice was loud, but it echoed off walls that had stopped listening. He tried again, this time digging at something deeper. You represent a country. That doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it never did. You still think a man with a gun on his hip is the answer to everything. That's not courage, Clint. That's a fantasy built for people afraid of change. Clint Eastwood did not blink. He studied De Niro for a long, cold moment before responding, his words slow and deliberate. I never said change was the enemy. But pretending the past was all wrong just to feel superior in the present? That's cowardice. The words dropped, like stones in water. Simple, heavy, impossible to ignore. De Niro's face tightened, and for a split second it looked like he might rise from his chair. But he didn't. Instead, he adjusted his jacket, clenched his fists against his knees, and narrowed his eyes. "You're playing the victim, Clint. Acting like you're the one under attack when people question the stories you told. That's not being a patriot. That's just ego." Eastwood leaned forward, elbows on knees, meeting De Niro's stare without flinching. "I don't need to defend my stories. They speak for themselves. The real question is, what do yours say about you?" Silence again. This time, even the audience didn't breathe. De Niro opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He glanced toward the hosts, hoping, perhaps, for a lifeline, a chance to pivot. But they were frozen, unwilling to shield either man from what was unfolding. Clint continued, voice steady. "I spent a career showing what men do when they're pushed to the edge. What they protect, what they lose. I didn't sugarcoat it. I didn't pretend they were perfect. I showed them as they were. Flawed, but fighting for something. And what are you fighting for now?" De Niro asked, sounding more desperate than defiant. Clint's eyes didn't waver. Clarity. That single word hit like a gavel. De Niro tried again, this time with more anger than precision. "You think you're some kind of national conscience? You think because you've played heroes that makes you one? You're just another old man scared of the world moving on without him." But the words rang hollow. There was no rhythm, no conviction, just noise. Clint didn't even respond. He didn't need to. The stillness said everything. De Niro had swung hard and missed. The hosts finally spoke, their tone forced. "Let's take a moment to reset," one of them offered, her smile stretched too tightly. "We want to make sure both of our guests have a chance to be heard." But they already had. And what had been heard could not be unheard. Eastwood sat back, cool and composed. De Niro sat forward, agitated and exposed. One looked like a man who had just walked through fire and come out unburned. The other looked like he had set the match and lost control of the flame. The segment was not over. Not yet. But the momentum had shifted. De Niro had come to confront, but he had underestimated the weight of a man who didn't raise his voice to prove his point. Eastwood had said little, but somehow it had been enough to leave the room quiet and his opponent visibly shaken. Whatever was coming next, it would not be a redemption. It would be reckoning. Something in Robert De Niro's demeanor had changed. His shoulders, once thrown back with confidence, now slouched slightly forward. His eyes darted between the hosts and the cameras, no longer locking onto Clint Eastwood with the same fire. Whatever bravado he entered the studio with had been peeled away, layer by layer, until what remained looked more like a man scrambling for footing than one standing on principle. The audience noticed. So did the hosts. And most of all, Clint Eastwood noticed. "You know what's funny?" Eastwood said, voice low but clear. "You spent the better part of this segment telling me what I represent. But the truth is, you never asked me. You just assumed." That stung. De Niro's face tightened, the kind of involuntary reaction that comes when someone hits too close to the truth. "I didn't need to ask," he said, trying to sound sure. "You've made it clear over decades." Clint raised an eyebrow. "Have I? Or have you just decided it's easier to make me your villain than to look at your own contradictions?" The words cut deep, not because they were loud, but because they were undeniable. The crowd murmured now, small ripples of realization spreading through the studio. The tension had inverted. Where once it was De Niro delivering blows, now it was Eastwood methodically dismantling his image. "You go on stage," Clint continued. "You call people names, you mock them in award shows, you act like you're the moral compass of the country. But all I see is performance, anger for applause. De Niro shook his head, but the conviction behind it had drained. "I speak out because I care," he muttered. Eastwood nodded. "So do I. But I do it without pretending I have all the answers. That's the difference. Between you and me, you shout over people, I listen." One of the hosts, sensing the shift, leaned in nervously. "Clint, are you saying Robert hasn't listened to opposing voices?" Eastwood's response came without hesitation. "I'm saying he listens only long enough to know when to yell." A gasp came from the far side of the room. The audience, who had arrived expecting casual interviews and light discussion, now sat transfixed by a man who had just pulled down the curtain on one of Hollywood's most untouchable icons. De Niro's voice cracked slightly as he tried to claw back control. "I've stood up to bullies my whole career, Clint. That doesn't make me wrong." "No," Clint agreed. "But mistaking every disagreement for a personal attack, that makes you insecure." Silence again. And then, it happened. A quiet clap. Just one from a woman in the second row, then another, then a small wave. Not a standing ovation, not a raucous cheer, but the kind of approval that comes from resonance, from truth hitting nerves no speechwriter could craft. De Niro's eyes flared. "You think this is some kind of victory? You think this proves something?" Clint didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He just looked at him, calm, steady, certain. "I didn't come here for victory," he said. "I came here to remind people that truth doesn't have to scream." And just like that, the narrative was no longer in De Niro's hands. He had tried to make a moment. Clint Eastwood had made a statement. And the country would remember the difference. As the segment wound toward its final minutes, the hosts scrambled to regain structure, tossing to commercial break, with voices too cheerful, too desperate to reclaim control. But it was too late. The real story had already written itself, and it wasn't the one anyone expected. The man they thought would be the villain had stood tall in silence. The man they expected to lead had found himself cornered by his own echo. And with one last breath before the break, Clint Eastwood leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Not from exhaustion, but peace. The cameras came back from commercial, but something had shifted in the air that no cue card or teleprompter could fix. The audience was hushed, the energy subdued but electric. The View, known for its carefully curated chaos, was no longer in control of the room. What remained was not a talk show. It was something closer to a reckoning, and all eyes returned to the two men at its center. Robert De Niro sat still, visibly chewing over every word that had been said before the break. The audience no longer leaned into his presence the way they had at the start. His name still carried weight, but for the first time it was Clint Eastwood who carried the room. One of the hosts tried to reset the tone. Her voice came light, almost airy, an attempt to cool the temperature. "Gentlemen, we know passions are high," she said, forcing a tight smile, "but we'd love to end on a more hopeful note. Maybe something you both agree on?" Clint turned to her slowly, as if the question had been asked in another language. "We can agree," he said, "that this country needs more people who think before they speak." The audience erupted, not in the raucous way they had earlier, but in a standing, thundering wave that felt like release. The moment had struck a nerve far beyond celebrity gossip or political theatrics. It had become something else entirely. Something primal. A call for honesty in a culture drowning in noise. De Niro didn't rise. He stared at the ground, lips pressed tightly together, jaw clenched. The applause wasn't for him anymore. He had come with fire, but Eastwood had walked through it without a flinch. The producers were now scrambling behind the scenes. One leaned in and whispered into the host's earpiece, but even their control had slipped. The audience, the cameras, the very narrative, none of it could be contained anymore. And then Clint stood up. The movement was simple, but its impact was seismic. The man who had once drawn crowds with nothing more than a squint and a whisper was now commanding an entire studio with silence, He turned to De Niro, who looked up at him with a face twisted between defiance and something that looked dangerously close to regret. Clint held out a hand. It was not a gesture of surrender or peace. It was something deeper, a challenge, a call, an offering of dignity. De Niro looked at the hand for a long time. The studio was silent. Even the cameras held their breath. Would he rise and reclaim some part of the moment? Would he show grace in defeat? Would he recognize that in losing the argument, he had the chance to win something greater? But he didn't take it. Instead, he looked away. And in that instant, the final blow was struck. Not by insult, but by absence. Clint withdrew his hand, slowly, and nodded once, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with finality. As Eastwood walked off the set, the crowd followed him with their eyes. De Niro remained seated, the applause trailing behind a man who had said little, raised no voice, but left behind a roar. Within minutes, the clip had gone viral. It exploded across every platform, headlines screaming, "Clint Eastwood silences Robert De Niro in live showdown." The moment Hollywood's toughest man took on its loudest voice, and Eastwood's calm destroys De Niro's fury. Commentators were stunned. Analysts dissected every phrase, and average viewers across the nation asked a simple question: what just happened? Because it wasn't just a clash between two actors. It was a collision of ideologies, of generations, of temperaments. It was a rare moment where charisma bowed to character, where volume was drowned by conviction, and where a man who once spoke through gunsmoke and grit proved that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand still and let the truth speak for you. Backstage, Clint Eastwood said nothing. He simply shook hands with the crew, gave a polite nod to the producers, and stepped into the car waiting for him outside. As for Robert De Niro, he left through a different door, flanked by staffers and silence. The world had witnessed something more than entertainment. It had seen a man confronted, and a legend rise, and the message lingered long after the cameras cut to black. Strength is not in how loudly you speak, but in how deeply you are heard.